A virgin maid decides to strip and pretend to faint on the mansion floor. All she wanted was to find out what the millionaire would do with her. But his touch wasn't what she expected, and it revealed something even more disturbing. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave your comment telling us where you are listening from. The rain fell heavily over Ravenwood Hills, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud, and making the silhouette of the mansion at the top of the hill even more somber. It was one of those days when Portland completely disappeared, swallowed by the fog rising from the valley, and the Blackwood Manor stood completely isolated from the world, like an island lost in time. Emily Morgan held tightly to the handle of her worn canvas bag as she climbed the steep trail leading to the back entrance of the property. At 23, she carried in her brown eyes a mixture of determination and caution that she had learned in the cold corridors of St. Vincent's Orphanage in rural Virginia. Each step she took sank into the wet earth, but she didn't slow her pace. She needed this job. More than that, she needed to leave the miserable boarding house where she shared a room with two other women in the outskirts of Portland. The housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, had been clear during the interview the previous week. The house is large, the routine is rigorous, and Mr. Richard doesn't like noise or curiosity. You clean, organize, and leave. No questions, no snooping. Understand? Emily had agreed, but now, faced with the imposing structure that looked more like a medieval castle lost in the Pacific Northwest forest, she felt a chill in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. The tall, narrow windows seemed like eyes watching her, and the stone towers covered with ivy gave the mansion an air of elegant abandonment, as if time had stopped there decades ago. "You arrived on time," said Mrs. Henderson, appearing at the back door with an impeccable apron and a severe expression. She was a woman in her 60s, with grey hair pulled back in a tight bun, radiating authority. "I hope you understood the rules well. Mr. Richard values discretion above all else." Emily nodded, wiping her feet on the doormat before entering. The interior of the mansion surprised her with its sumptuousness. Dark wooden antique furniture, faded Persian rugs, huge paintings with portraits of stern-looking people hanging on walls covered with Victorian wallpaper. Everything exuded history, old money, and an almost palpable melancholy. "The house has 3 floors and a basement," explained Mrs. Henderson as they walked through the corridors. "The ground floor has the main halls, the library, the dining room, and the kitchen. The second floor contains the guest rooms and Mr. Richard's office. The third floor is off-limits. Never, under any circumstances, go up there. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Richard works from home in his office. He usually stays locked in there from 9 in the morning until 6 in the afternoon. You clean in the morning, always starting with the lower floor, then go up to the second when he's already gone down for lunch. He has lunch alone in his office, so you'll have enough time." Emily absorbed every piece of information, but her attention was divided between the instructions and the details of the house. There was something strange in the air, a feeling that the walls held secrets. In some rooms, she felt as if someone was watching her, even when she was alone. And then there were the sounds, small creaks, as if someone was walking on the floor above, even when Mrs. Henderson assured her that Mr. Richard was in his office on the second floor. "One last thing," said the housekeeper, stopping in front of a solid wooden door at the end of a corridor. "This is the main hall. There's an antique mirror there that has belonged to the family for generations. Be careful when cleaning it. It's a valuable piece." Emily looked at the mirror and felt a shiver. It was an imposing specimen with an ornate gold frame, but there was something disturbing about the way it reflected light. For a moment, she had the impression that her image had taken a second longer to appear in the reflection. "Understood," she murmured, looking away. The first weeks passed without incident. Emily developed an efficient routine. She arrived at 7 in the morning, when the fog still covered the mansion, and finished work around 2 in the afternoon. She rarely saw the boss, only heard his steps on the floor above or the sound of papers being turned in the office. Mrs. Henderson had described Richard Blackwood as a reserved, middle-aged man who had inherited a considerable fortune from his family, but Emily had not yet exchanged a single word with him. Until on a rainy Thursday that changed. She was cleaning the library when she heard footsteps coming down the main staircase. Slow, measured footsteps, different from the hurried steps of the other staff members. Instinctively, she ducked behind a bookshelf, not out of fear, but from a sudden curiosity to finally see the man everyone spoke about in whispers. Richard Blackwood entered the library, and Emily held her breath. He was different from what she had imagined. Not the middle-aged man she expected, but someone in his early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark grey wool sweater and tailored pants. His black hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it many times, and when he turned in her direction, she could see his eyes. Grey like the fog outside, but with a depth that made her feel as if he could see through walls. He headed to one of the shelves, looked for a specific book, and upon finding it, stopped. He stood there, with the book in his hands, as if he had completely forgotten why he had picked it up. There was a sadness in his posture that Emily recognized immediately. It was the same sadness she saw in the mirror every morning, the sadness of someone carrying a weight that no one else could share. It was then that he spoke, without turning to her. "I know you're there." Emily felt her heart race. She had been discovered, but something in the tone of his voice didn't sound like a reprimand. It sounded like recognition. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood," she said, coming out from behind the bookshelf with her face burning with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to... Curiosity is not a fault," he interrupted her, finally turning to face her. The grey eyes studied her for a long moment, and Emily had the strange sensation that he was recognizing her too, as if he had seen her before, in some impossible place to remember. "What's your name?" "Emily Morgan, sir." "Emily?" he repeated, the name as if testing the sound in his own voice. "How long have you been working here?" "3 weeks, sir." He nodded but didn't say anything else. He just continued to stare at her with that disconcerting intensity until Emily began to feel naked under that gaze. It wasn't a predatory look, she realized. It was a look of recognition, of searching, as if he were trying to decipher an enigma she didn't know she carried. "Get back to your work," he said finally, but his voice sounded softer than before. Emily made a small curtsy and left the library with trembling legs. Something had happened in that encounter, something she couldn't name but that had definitely changed the atmosphere of the mansion. From that day on, she began to feel his presence differently, not just as the distant boss, but as a magnetic force that attracted and haunted her at the same time. In the following weeks, the encounters between Emily and Richard became more frequent, but always brief, always charged with a tension she didn't know how to interpret. He would appear in the rooms where she worked, not to supervise, but as if drawn by an invisible force. He would stay there watching her clean the antique furniture or arrange the books, and sometimes mutter comments that seemed more directed at himself than at her. "You have delicate hands for heavy work," he said one afternoon when he found her polishing the mahogany dining room table. Emily stopped moving and looked at her own hands, calloused from a harsh life, but still small and feminine. "My mother had hands like that," he added, and left the room before she could respond. It was always like that. Fragmented comments, looks that lasted too long, an atmosphere of intimacy that grew without either of them making any concrete move to nurture it. Emily began to catch herself thinking about him outside of working hours, imagining what his life was like before he became that reclusive and melancholic man. She wondered about the Blackwood family, about the portraits covered with sheets on the forbidden 3rd floor, about the whispers of the other employees. It was Martha, the cook, who began to drop hints during the lunches they had together in the kitchen. Martha was a robust 50-year-old woman, born and raised in the region, who knew all the secrets of the rich families of Ravenwood Hills. "The Blackwood family was always strange," she said one afternoon, as she peeled potatoes for the boss's dinner. "Richard is the only one left, you know. His parents and older brother died in a car accident about 15 years ago. He was about 29 at the time, the youngest son, a bit rebellious. They said he was going to be disinherited. "What kind of accident?" asked Emily, trying to sound casual as she organized the lunch dishes. Car rolled over on the descent. From the hills on a rainy night. Strange thing, his father had been driving that road for 30 years, knew every curve by heart. But you know how it is, right? When God wants to take someone, he takes them. Martha lowered her voice and moved. Closer. Except some people say that's not quite what happened. The car didn't have any skid marks, and Richard was in the city that night. There were witnesses, but still there was a feeling, you know? Emily felt a shiver. What kind of feeling? They suspected him. That he had arranged everything, you know, to get the inheritance. But they never managed to prove anything, and he was never officially investigated. The rich have their privileges. Martha sighed. After that, he changed completely. Before, he was outgoing, had girlfriends, traveled the world. After the accident, he locked himself in this house and never went out again. He only receives Dr. Matthews when he gets sick, and barely even then. Dr. Matthews? Doctor from the village, good man that one, takes care of the poor for free and the rich when needed. He knew Richard's parents. I think he was even the one who attended to them at the time of the accident. Martha shook her head. Poor Richard. Guilty or innocent, he carries all that weight alone. That conversation planted a seed of dangerous curiosity in Emily's heart. She began to observe Richard with different eyes, looking for signs of guilt or innocence in his gestures, in his expressions. And the more she observed him, the more she became convinced that there was something deeply wounded in that man, something that went beyond simple sadness over the loss of his family. It was on a stormy night, when she should have left earlier because of the weather, that Emily made a decision that would change everything. Mrs. Henderson had dismissed the staff at 4 in the afternoon, concerned about the intensity of the rain, but Emily had hidden in the basement until she was sure she was alone in the mansion with Richard. The storm made the entire house shake. The winds howled between the stone towers, and the rain beat against the windows with a violence that seemed to want to break the glass. It was the kind of night when the mansion revealed its true haunted nature, with creaks, pops, and sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Emily climbed the main staircase with her heart pounding. She knew Richard was in his office, on the 2nd floor. She could see the light under the door. But instead of going there, she made an impulsive decision. She headed to the stairs that led to the forbidden 3rd floor. The door that blocked access was unlocked. Emily pushed it, slowly, and it opened with a long, melancholy groan. The 3rd floor corridor was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the lightning that came through the windows. There was a smell of mold and abandonment, but also something more subtle, almost imperceptible. A woman's perfume, as if someone had passed by recently. The first room she found was covered in dust and furniture wrapped in sheets, but the 2nd room was different. The door was ajar, and when Emily pushed it, she found an environment that didn't seem abandoned. There was a grand piano in the center of the room, some sheet music scattered on the lid, and portraits on the walls that weren't covered like the others. She approached the portraits, and what she saw left her breathless. In one of the photographs, there was a family gathered, an elegant middle-aged man, a blonde woman with a sweet smile, and 2 young men. She immediately recognized Richard, younger, next to who must have been his older brother. But it was the other portrait that made her stagger. It was a photograph of a young woman, no more than 20 years old, with wavy brown hair and dark eyes that were surprisingly familiar. She wore a simple uniform, like that of a maid, and smiled shyly at the camera. But what shocked Emily most was the face. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. The resemblance was striking, almost supernatural. "Claire," murmured a voice behind her. Emily turned quickly and found Richard standing in the doorway, his face as pale as the lightning light. He didn't seem surprised to find her there, just devastated. "Who is she?" asked Emily, her voice coming out trembling. Richard approached slowly as if he were walking toward a precipice. "Claire Morgan. She worked here 24 years ago." He stopped in front of the portrait, and Emily could see tears forming in his grey eyes. "She was a little older than you when she died." Morgan? Emily felt the world spinning around. Her? Like me? It's not a coincidence, Richard whispered, finally looking directly at her. I knew from the first moment I saw you. You're exactly like her. Not just the face, but the way you walk, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking, the way you bite your lower lip when you're nervous. Emily instinctively brought her hand to her lip, which was in fact between her teeth. That's impossible. Claire died in this room, continued Richard, his voice getting lower and lower. They say it was an accident, that she fell from the window on a rainy night, but I was here, I saw. What did you see? Richard closed his eyes, and the sound of the rain seemed to get louder, as if the storm itself was waiting for his answer. When he opened them again, there was a pain there that cut Emily's heart like a blade. I saw her being pushed. The silence that followed Richard's confession was deafening. Emily felt the blood pulsing in her ears, mixed with the sound of the rain that lashed the windows of the third floor. The revelation that Claire had been murdered, and that Richard had witnessed it all, created a new and terrifying reality that she didn't know how to process. "Why did you never say anything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard moved away from the portrait and walked to the window, the same one from which Claire had fallen. His hands trembled when he leaned on the stone parapet. I was young, cowardly, and in love with her. My father had forbidden her from getting close to me, threatened to fire her if he discovered any involvement between us. That night, I came looking for her here in her room. I wanted us to run away together. Emily approached slowly, hypnotized by the confession. And what happened? When I arrived, she was already being confronted by someone. I hid in the corridor and heard the argument. Claire was pregnant. Richard's voice faltered. And it wasn't mine. Emily's world collapsed. The physical resemblance, the same last name, the age that matched perfectly. 24 years ago, Claire had died after discovering a pregnancy. The pieces of the puzzle fit together with cruel precision. "My mother," she murmured, more to herself than to Richard. When I realized what was happening, it was too late. I saw when she was pushed, I heard the scream, the sound of the body hitting the ground below. And I did nothing. I was paralyzed, hidden like a coward. "Who was it?" The question came out like a roar. "Who killed my mother?" Richard turned to her, and for the first time since she had met him, Emily saw real fear in his eyes. "My father, Edward Blackwood. He discovered about the pregnancy and flew into a rage. Said he wouldn't allow the family name to be tainted by a bastard." The anger that exploded in Emily's chest was like molten lava. 24 years of abandonment, of orphanage, of loneliness, of wondering who she was and where she came from. And now she discovered that her mother had been murdered by the very father of the man she was falling in love with. "And you stayed silent," she said, her voice sharp as glass. "You let me grow up without knowing anything, without having anyone, while you inherited everything that should rightfully be mine." "Emily, please, no." She backed away when he tried to touch her. "You hired me knowing who I was. You brought me to this house, to this room where she died, knowing everything. Why?" Richard ran his hands through his hair, desperation showing in every gesture. "Because I couldn't live with the guilt. Because every night I see her fall from that window, and every morning I wake up knowing I could have prevented it. When I found out you had grown up at St. Vincent's orphanage, that you were in Portland looking for work, I thought I could somehow compensate." "Compensate?" The word came out like a slap. "You think giving me a cleaning job in the house where my mother was murdered is compensation?" I didn't know how to. I wanted to tell the truth, but I couldn't find the words. "And then you arrived, and it was as if she had come back. Not just the appearance, but the essence, the way you observe everything, as if you're constantly deciphering secrets. Claire was like that." Emily felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Tell me about her, about who she really was." Richard took a deep breath as if preparing to open an old wound. "Claire came from Virginia, just like you. She was an orphan too, raised by nuns in a convent in Goldfield. My mother brought her when she was 18 to work as a personal maid. She was intelligent, observant, had a thirst for knowledge that impressed everyone. She spent her free hours reading in the library, teaching herself French and Italian. And you got involved? Not in the way you think. We were friends, confidants. She listened to me talk about my plans to travel the world, to escape the bonds of the family, and I listened to her dream of a different life, of studying, having a profession. It was innocent, pure. He made a painful pause, until it wasn't anymore. Who was the father of the child? Richard's hesitation said everything before he even pronounced the name. Dr. Samuel Matthews. Emily felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. The village doctor, the man Martha had described as kind and trustworthy. Does he know I'm her daughter? I suspect so. Samuel is intelligent, always has been. When you arrived here, he started appearing more frequently, always making excuses. To come to the mansion. Says it's to take care of my health, but I know it's to observe you. Has he been here recently? Yesterday. Said he wanted to examine some symptoms I've been feeling, but spent the entire visit asking questions about you, how you were adapting, if you seemed happy, if you had mentioned anything about your family. Emily began to walk, back and forth across the room, trying to process all the information. Her mother had been murdered by the Blackwood patriarch for being pregnant with the village doctor's child. Richard had witnessed everything and remained silent for 24 years, and now the doctor himself, her biological father, was prowling around the mansion observing her. Why did your father kill my mother if the child wasn't even yours? What was the problem? Because Claire worked for our family. In his mind, that tainted our reputation, and also because... Richard hesitated again. Because what? Because Claire had discovered something about the family business, something that could destroy our fortune and our social position. She wasn't just a pregnant employee, she was a dangerous witness. The storm outside seemed to be diminishing, but inside the room, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly charged. Emily looked again at the portrait of her mother, looking for similarities, looking for answers, looking for a connection with that woman she had never known but who had given her life for her. What kind of thing did she discover? My father didn't get rich just through legitimate business. There were corruption schemes involving public contracts, money laundering, bribing politicians. Claire cleaned his office and had access to documents she shouldn't have seen. She was too observant for her own good. How do you know this? Because after she died, I found a letter she had written to Samuel, hidden among the books in the library. She told about the pregnancy, about the documents she had found, about the fear she felt from my father. She said that, if anything happened, to her he should look for the evidence she had hidden. Emily stopped walking. What evidence? We never found it. Claire was smart, must have hidden it very well. But I believe it's still somewhere in this house. And you never looked? I searched for years. I turned over every corner, every piece of antique furniture, every floorboard. But this house is a labyrinth. It has hiding places that even I don't know about. Richard looked directly at her. Until you arrived. Me? What do I have to do with this? You have the same instincts as your mother, the same ability to observe details that go unnoticed. If anyone can find what Claire hid, it's you. Emily felt a mix of excitement and terror. The possibility of finding something her mother had left, something that could bring justice for her death, was irresistible. But she also knew she was treading on dangerous ground. If I find this evidence, what happens? The truth comes out. About Claire's death, about my father's crimes, about everything. Richard came closer to her, and this time she didn't back away. And maybe, finally, I can forgive myself for having been a coward when you needed me most. Emily stared at him for a long moment, seeing for the first time not the powerful and mysterious man who intimidated her, but the terrified young man who had witnessed her mother's murder and lived with that guilt for decades. It was a humanizing revelation that completely changed the dynamic between them. If we're going to do this, she said finally, let's do it right. But first I need to know one thing. Anything. The accident that killed your parents and your brother, did it have anything to do with my mother's death? The silence that followed Emily's question was more eloquent than any answer. Richard looked away, and she immediately knew she had touched the most sensitive nerve in that entire dark story. "Richard," she insisted, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "The accident had something to do with my mother's death, didn't it?" He walked to the window again, his back tense under the wool sweater. When he spoke, his voice came out so low that she had to approach to hear. 3 years after Claire's death, my father started receiving anonymous letters. Someone knew the truth about the murder and was demanding money to keep silent. Blackmail? At first he paid. They were small amounts that wouldn't be missed in the family budget. But the demands increased, and the letters became more specific. Whoever it was knew intimate details of the night Claire died. They knew about the documents she had discovered, about the conversation that happened before she was pushed. Emily felt a chill in her stomach. Dr. Matthews? That's what my father suspected. Samuel was the only person who could have access to the letter Claire wrote, the only one who would know so many details, but he never managed to prove it. And then? Richard turned to face her, and what she saw in his eyes haunted her. It wasn't just guilt or sadness. It was a deep fear, the fear of a man who knows the true extent of the darkness he carries. My father decided he had to end the blackmail once and for all. He arranged a meeting with the blackmailer on an isolated road in the hills, on a rainy night like this one. He took my brother Robert and my mother as witnesses to prove he had nothing to hide from the family. And you? I was supposed to have gone too. We were all supposed to be together, presenting a united front against whoever was threatening our family. But at the last minute I made an excuse, said I was sick, that I had commitments in the city. He laughed bitterly. The truth is that I was a coward. I was afraid of discovering who really knew about Claire, afraid of facing the consequences of my silence. And they went alone. They did, and they never came back. Richard's voice broke. The car was found at the bottom of the precipice the next day. The brakes had been cut. Emily brought her hand to her mouth, horrified. You think Dr. Matthews? I don't know. For years I wondered if he was capable of that. If a man who dedicates his life to saving people would be capable of murdering 3 at once. But when you arrived here, when I saw how he reacted to your presence... Richard shook his head. There's something in his eyes when he looks at you. It's not just the tenderness of a father seeing his daughter for the first time. It's possessiveness, control. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a terrifying image. Dr. Matthews had blackmailed Edward Blackwood for 3 years, accumulating money and power over the family. When Edward tried to confront him, he had orchestrated an accident. That eliminated 3 people at once. And now, 24 years later, his daughter was living in the same house where her mother had been murdered. Why didn't he look for me before? Asked Emily. If he's really my father, why did he let me grow up in the orphanage? Because you were living evidence of his involvement with Claire. As long as you were far away, no one would make the connection. But now that you're here, in the Blackwood house working for me, Richard made a significant pause. He needs to have control over the situation. Control how? I don't know, but I suspect we'll find out soon. As if his words had invoked fate, the sound of a doorbell echoed through the mansion. It was almost midnight, and the storm had finally ceased, leaving only the constant dripping of rain from the eaves. Who could it be at this hour? Murmured Emily. Richard tensed. Mrs. Henderson has the keys, but she would never come here during a storm. And the other staff members... He stopped talking when the doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. Richard? The voice that came from below was familiar, polite, concerned. It's me, Samuel. I saw there's still light in the house. Is everything all right? Emily felt her blood freeze. To be there, on the forbidden 3rd floor, discovering secrets that had cost her mother's life and the Blackwood family's, and suddenly find herself in the presence of the man who could be both her father and a multiple murderer. What do we do? She whispered. Richard took her by the hand, and she felt the strength and warmth emanating from him. For the first time, it wasn't just physical attraction or intellectual curiosity, it was trust. We go down and face this together, but First, he went to an old dresser in the corner of the room and opened the bottom drawer. From inside, he removed a small but well-maintained pistol. This was my father's. I learned to shoot when I was a teenager. You think he's going to try? I don't know what he's going to try, but I won't let what happened to your mother happen to you. They descended the stairs in silence, their steps muffled by the old carpet. The doorbell rang for the third time when they reached the ground floor, and Richard gestured for Emily to position herself behind the library door, where she could hear everything but remain hidden. When Richard opened the main door, Dr. Samuel Matthews was there, soaked by the rain, carrying his traditional medical bag and a concerned smile that seemed genuine. Sorry about the hour, Richard, but I was passing by the road when I saw the lights on and got worried. With all this storm... Samuel entered without being invited, shaking the rain off his coat. He was a man in his mid-50s with well-groomed grey hair, intelligent brown eyes, and a presence that radiated professional confidence. Have you been well? You're not having those insomnia episodes again? I'm fine, Samuel. I was just reading in the library. Until this hour? The doctor looked around the hall, and Emily had the impression he was looking for something specific. Or someone. And the new girl. Emily, isn't it? Did she get home safely with all this rain? There was something in the way he pronounced her name that made Emily shrink behind the door. It wasn't casual. It was intimate, familiar, as if he had the right to worry about her. All the staff left earlier because of the weather, replied Richard, and Emily noticed the tension in his voice. That's good. Young girls shouldn't be walking around alone during storms, especially girls like her. Samuel made a pause, loaded with meaning. She reminds me of someone I knew a long time ago. Really? A very special woman. Claire, Morgan. You remember her, don't you, Richard? The silence that followed was charged with electricity. Emily held her breath, knowing she was witnessing the moment when all masks would fall. I remember, Richard finally said. Claire was an extraordinary woman. Intelligent, observant, brave, sometimes too brave for her own good. Samuel walked through the hall, examining the paintings on the walls as if seeing them for the first time. She discovered things she shouldn't have discovered, asked questions she shouldn't have asked, and paid the price for it. She did indeed, but before paying she was very clever. She hid certain things in places where she knew they would be safe. Samuel stopped in front of the old mirror in the main hall, the same one that always disturbed Emily. The question is, where would an intelligent woman hide evidence in a house like this? Richard didn't answer, but Emily saw his hand move discreetly, toward the place where he was hiding the gun. You know, Richard, I've been observing young Emily during these past few weeks. She has the same instincts as her mother, the same curiosity, the same tendency to appear in places where she shouldn't. Samuel turned and looked directly at the direction where Emily was hiding. Isn't that right, dear? Emily's heart stopped. He knew she was there. He probably always knew. Emily came out from behind the library door, her heart pounding in her chest, but her gaze defiant. There was no point in hiding anymore. Dr. Samuel Matthews observed her with a mixture of paternal pride and something darker that she couldn't identify. "Hello, Dad," she said, the word coming out like a sharp blade. Samuel smiled, and for the first time since he had arrived, his mask of concerned doctor fell completely. What remained was a calculating, dangerous man who had planned this moment for a long time. You were always as smart as your mother. Claire also had that ability, to get straight to the point. Unlike her, I won't be pushed from any window, replied Emily, positioning herself next to Richard. I would never hurt you, dear. You're all I have left of Claire. Samuel walked through the hall with the familiarity of someone who knows every piece of furniture, every floorboard. I spent 24 years taking care of you from a distance, paying for your education at the orphanage, ensuring you had the best I could offer without revealing who I was. Paying with the money you stole from the Blackwoods, said Richard, his voice loaded with contempt. Stole? Samuel laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the ancient walls. Richard, your father murdered the woman I loved, and the child she carried in her womb. What price do you put on a life? On 2 lives? Claire wasn't carrying your child when she died, said Emily, the revelation coming out before she could contain herself. She was carrying me. I survived. The silence that followed was absolute. Samuel stopped walking, his eyes widening with a mixture of shock and something that seemed to be hope. "That's impossible," he murmured. "I examined Claire's body. She was dead, and the child—" "The child survived," interrupted Richard. "Edward didn't know Claire had given birth before she died. She hid the pregnancy until the end, wearing loose clothes, avoiding you and others who might notice. When she realized she was in danger, she arranged a way to protect the child." Emily felt the world spinning around her. "How do you know this?" "Because I was there," said a new voice from the entrance of the hall. Everyone turned to see Mrs. Henderson standing at the door, no longer the efficient and discreet housekeeper Emily knew. There was an authority in her posture, a dignity that completely transformed her presence. "Mrs. Henderson?" Richard seemed as surprised as the others. "I was your mother's personal maid at that time, Richard. I knew every secret of this house, every movement of the masters." She entered the hall with firm steps. "And when Claire came to me, desperate, knowing her life was in danger, I helped her." "You helped how?" asked Emily, her voice trembling. "Claire gave birth in silence, in the back room of the house, with my help. It was a small but healthy child, a beautiful girl with her mother's eyes." Mrs. Henderson looked directly at Emily. "When Edward discovered the document she had found, when he confronted her that terrible night, Claire had already taken her. Precautions. What precautions? She gave you to me, still a baby, and made me promise to take you far away from there. She gave me money she had saved, some of your belongings, and a sealed envelope that she told me never to open unless your life was in danger." Mrs. Henderson sighed deeply. "That same night I took you to St. Vincent's orphanage and made up a story about finding an abandoned child." Dr. Matthews had turned completely pale. "You mean that all these years you've been blackmailing and killing people for a daughter who wasn't yours," completed Mrs. Henderson. "Claire never told you the child wasn't yours because she knew that would put her in even more danger." "Then who is my father?" asked Emily, feeling she needed to lean on Richard to avoid falling. "Robert Blackwood," said Mrs. Henderson simply. "Richard's older brother. They fell in love in secret, but Robert was married, had children. When Claire discovered she was pregnant, he panicked. It was he who told Edward about the relationship, hoping his father would find a discreet solution." Richard went livid. "My brother? Robert didn't expect your father to react with such violence. When Edward killed Claire, Robert was devastated. It was he who began to blackmail his own father, consumed by guilt. But then, Dr. Matthews was having difficulty processing the information. The blackmail letters weren't mine. They were. From Robert. He signed as a friend of the truth, demanding money he intended to use to care for the child he believed he had lost along with Claire. Mrs. Henderson looked at Richard with pity. "Your brother lived tormented. When your father arranged the meeting that night in the hills, Robert knew it would be a final confrontation. He sabotaged his own car because he couldn't bear to live with the guilt anymore." "He killed himself," murmured Richard, "and killed our parents along with him. It was an accident he didn't plan. Robert only wanted to die, but the car was full." Mrs. Henderson shook her head sadly. "And you, Dr. Matthews, spent all these years believing you were Emily's father, when in reality you were just the doctor who loved Claire in silence." Samuel collapsed into an armchair, the weight of 24 years of unnecessary vengeance falling on his shoulders. "I killed 3 innocent people." "Edward wasn't innocent," said Emily, her voice coming out harder than she intended. "He killed my mother." "But his wife and your brother—" Samuel looked at Richard with despair. "God, what have I done?" "You did what you believed was justice," said Richard, surprising everyone with the absence of anger in his voice. "I spent 24 years hating myself for not preventing Claire's death. You spent the same time trying to avenge a woman you loved. We were both destroyed by the same tragedy." Emily looked around the hall at the 3 people who had shaped her existence without her knowing. Mrs. Henderson, who had saved her as a baby and brought her back as an adult. Richard, her half-brother, son of the man who killed her mother. Samuel, who had dedicated his life to a revenge based on a lie. "The evidence," she said suddenly. "Mrs. Henderson, you said my mother gave you a sealed envelope." "Yes, I kept it all these years," as she asked. "Where is it?" Mrs. Henderson smiled for the first time that night. "In the place where Claire knew it would be safe, in the only location in this house where a man like Edward would never look." "Where?" "On the altar of the chapel in the basement. Claire knew the secrets of this house better than anyone. She knew there was a hidden chapel where the original family hid their riches during the wars. She sealed the evidence of Edward's crimes in a metal box and hid it behind the image of Our Lady." Richard was dumbfounded. "There's a chapel in the basement. There are many things in this house that you don't know about, boy. Your family has kept secrets for generations." Mrs. Henderson headed to the door. "Come, it's time for your mother to finally have justice." As they descended the narrow staircase that led to the basement, Emily felt she was walking toward her destiny, not just to discover the evidence that could incriminate her mother's murderer, but to finally understand who she really was and what her place was in this dark story that had begun long before her birth. Behind her, she heard the footsteps of Richard, Dr. Matthews, and Mrs. Henderson, 4 people linked by lies, guilt, love, and tragedy, walking together toward the truth that could either free them or destroy them definitively. The basement of the mansion was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and forgotten chambers that smelled of moisture and ancient history. Mrs. Henderson guided them with a powerful flashlight, her sure steps demonstrating a familiarity with those paths that impressed even Richard. "How many secrets does this house still hide?" he murmured, observing the stone walls that seemed centuries old. "More than you imagine," replied Mrs. Henderson. "The Blackwoods built this property on the foundations of a colonial farm. During the Liberal Revolution of 1842, they hid weapons and compromising documents down here. Later, during the Old Republic, your great-grandfather used these tunnels for secret political meetings." Emily walked in silence, still processing the revelation that Richard was her half-brother. The attraction she had felt for him in recent weeks had now transformed into something different, more complex. It wasn't repulsion. It was impossible to deny the connection that existed between them, but a new understanding that they were linked by bonds of blood and tragedy that went beyond any romance. Dr. Matthews followed behind them, carrying the weight of his guilt like a cross. With each step he seemed to shrink more, the confident and dangerous man of moments ago replaced by someone broken by the discovery that he had dedicated half his life to an unnecessary vengeance. "Here," said Mrs. Henderson, stopping in front of a wall that looked the same as all the others. But when she pressed a specific stone, an ancient mechanism creaked and a secret door opened, revealing a small chapel carved into the rock. The air that came out from inside was different, charged with old incense and something more sacred. Mrs. Henderson entered first, and when she lit the candles that were arranged around the altar, the environment illuminated with an unexpected beauty. The chapel was small but ornate, with faded frescoes on the walls and an image of Our Lady of Sorrows on the main altar. There were carved wooden benches and a silver crucifix that reflected the light of the candles as if made of stars. "Your mother came here when she needed peace," said Mrs. Henderson to Emily. "It was the only place in the house where she felt truly safe." Emily approached the image of Our Lady, feeling an inexplicable connection to that space. It was as if she could feel Claire's presence there, as if her mother had left a bit of her essence imprinted on the ancient stones. "Behind the image," instructed Mrs. Henderson. Richard helped Emily carefully move the statue, revealing a niche carved into the wall. Inside it was a small but sturdy metal box, protected by a silk cloth that time had turned yellowish. With trembling hands, Emily removed the box and opened it. Inside, she found carefully organized papers, photographs, and a sealed letter with wax that bore her name written in Claire's elegant handwriting. "A letter for me," she murmured, her eyes filling with tears. "Your mother hoped that one day you would be able to read it," said Mrs. Henderson softly. Emily broke the seal with reverent care, and unfolded the paper yellowed by time. Claire's voice seemed to leap from the pages, as if she were there whispering in her daughter's ear. My dear daughter, if you are reading this letter, it means you have managed to find the truth that I could not tell in life. Your name is Emily, because it means hard-working and eager, and you were my greatest joy even in the darkest moments. Your father is Robert Blackwood, a good man who lost himself in fear and cowardice. Don't judge him too harshly. Love sometimes makes us weak when we should be strong. I loved him, but I love you more than my own life. That's why, if something happens to me, know that every decision I made was thinking of protecting you. Edward. Blackwood is a dangerous man who enriched himself through crimes that stained this family with blood. The evidence is all here. Documents that prove bribery, ordered murders, theft of public lands. Use them to bring justice not just for me, but for all the other victims he has made over the years. Be strong, my daughter, be brave, and know that wherever I am, I will always be watching over you. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she read, and when she finished, she felt as if she had finally found the missing piece of her soul. Her mother had thought of her until the last moment, had risked everything to protect her and leave her a legacy of truth and justice. The documents, said Richard softly, examining the remaining papers in the box. There are dozens of them. Falsified contracts, receipts for illegal payments, even photographs of secret meetings. Dr. Matthews approached, his face pale in the candlelight. May I see? Richard hesitated, but Emily nodded. He has the right to know the truth, too. As Samuel examined the documents, his expression changed from remorse to horror. My God, he murmured. Edward wasn't just corrupt. He was a monster. These photos, they're of people who disappeared over the years, rural workers who opposed the taking of their lands, politicians who threatened to expose his schemes. How many people did he kill? Asked Emily. From the documents here, at least 15 that we can prove. Claire discovered all this because she cleaned his office and had access to the secret safe where he kept his souvenirs. Samuel shook his head, disgusted. She wasn't killed just for being pregnant. She was killed because she represented the greatest threat he had ever faced. And now? Richard looked at the other three. What do we do with all this? My father has been dead for 15 years. Human justice can no longer reach him. But it can reach his victims, said Emily, drying her tears and standing up with a new determination. The families who lost loved ones, the people who had their lands stolen, the children who grew up without parents, they deserve to know the truth. This will completely destroy the Blackwood name, warned Mrs. Henderson. Good, said Richard. Simply, it deserves to be destroyed. Emily looked at him with surprise. Are you sure? It's your heritage, your name, your social position? It's dirty blood, replied Richard. I'd rather be a poor, honest man than a rich man built on corpses. He took her hand, and the gesture had nothing romantic about it. It was the touch of a brother, of an ally, of someone who had finally found a purpose. Besides, you're the true heir to this house. You're the firstborn's daughter. You have more right than I do to all of this. I don't want anything that comes from blood, said Emily, but I can use this fortune to repair the damage Edward caused. Dr. Matthews, who had remained silent examining the documents, looked up with a new expression. There's something you need to know. About Robert. What about him? Asked Richard. According to these documents, Robert tried to stop his father several times. There are letters here where he threatens to expose Edward if the murders didn't stop. He wasn't an accomplice. He was another prisoner of his own family. Emily felt a deep sadness for the father she never knew, a man who had tried to do the right thing but got lost in fear and family pressure. Did he really love my mother? From the notes she kept, yes, but it was an impossible love surrounded by fear and secrets. Samuel sighed. Maybe if I hadn't spent all these years obsessed with revenge, we could have discovered the truth sooner. We could have given Robert the chance to be the father you deserved. The past cannot be changed, said Emily, carefully storing her mother's letter, but the future is still in our hands. As they climbed back to the main floor of the mansion, each carried a part of the truth that had freed and condemned them at the same time. They knew that revealing those documents would change not only their lives, but those of many other people. It was a heavy responsibility, but for the first time in decades it was a shared responsibility. Dawn was approaching when they finally left the basement, and through the high windows of the mansion they could see the first rays of sun cutting through the fog of the hills. It was as if nature itself was announcing that a new era was beginning for all of them. The days that followed the discovery of the evidence were intense and transformative. Emily had temporarily moved into one of the guest rooms of the mansion, no longer as an employee, but as a family member who was finally taking her place in the history of the Blackwoods. The dynamic between her and Richard had completely transformed. Where before there had been sexual tension and dangerous attraction, now there was deep complicity, the protective affection between siblings who had found each other too late, but still in time to rebuild what remained of their lives. Richard had contacted a lawyer specializing in historical crimes, Dr. Marcus Sanders, an upright 40-year-old man who was impressed with the extent of the evidence Claire had collected. For 3 consecutive days he examined each document, each photograph, each piece of evidence, linking Edward Blackwood to decades of corruption and murders. "This is enough material to reopen at least 12 archived cases," he said on a sunny morning as he organized the papers on the library table. "And probably discover others we didn't even know existed. Do you have any idea what you're about to unleash?" "We do," replied Emily, sitting next to Richard, "and we're prepared for the consequences. The family fortune will be confiscated. The mansion might be auctioned to pay compensation, and you'll be at the center of a national scandal. The media will be relentless." "All the better," said Richard. "At least it will be a scandal based on truth." Dr. Matthews, who had spent the last few nights without sleep, processing decades of misguided vengeance, looked up from the documents he was examining. "And the families of the victims? Do they have the right to know?" "All of them," confirmed the lawyer. "I've already identified at least 8 families who lost members in suspicious circumstances that can now be clarified. It will be painful for many people, but it will also be liberating." It was at that moment that Mrs. Henderson entered the library, carrying a tray with coffee and a sealed envelope. "This arrived for Miss Emily," she said, and there was a concern in her voice that made everyone alert. Emily took the envelope. There was no sender, just her name written in an unknown handwriting. When she opened it, she found a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Some truths are too dangerous to be revealed. Edward Blackwood had powerful partners who are still alive. If the documents are handed over to the authorities, you will follow the same path as your mother. Burn everything and live in peace." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Richard was the first to react, taking the paper from Emily's trembling hands. "It's not true," he said, but his voice didn't sound convincing. "They're just trying to intimidate us." "Richard," said Dr. Matthews softly, "your father didn't build a criminal empire alone. He obviously had connections, people who benefited from his schemes and who now have a lot to lose if the truth comes out." Dr. Sanders examined the paper with a somber expression. "The language suggests intimate knowledge of the facts. Whoever wrote this knows details that weren't in the newspapers of the time." "What are you suggesting?" asked Emily, trying to keep her voice steady. "That we give up? That we let my mother's death continue to go unpunished?" "I'm suggesting that we be very careful," replied the lawyer. "Perhaps it would be better to deliver everything directly to the federal prosecutor's office in Washington, D.C., instead of using local authorities. And you need to think about protection." It was then that Richard made a decision that surprised everyone. "I'm not going to hide," he said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the hills. "I spent 24 years hiding from the truth, living like a prisoner in this house. If someone wants to kill me for doing the right thing, let them come." "Richard, don't be reckless," warned Samuel. "What's reckless is living a lie for the rest of my life." Richard turned to face the others. "Emily, if you want to back out, I understand. You've already lost a mother because of my family's crimes. So I won't let you lose your own life too." Emily stood up and walked to where he was. For the first time since she discovered they were siblings, she touched his face with fraternal tenderness. "We both lost parents because of these crimes. We both grew up lonely and haunted by secrets that weren't ours. If we're going to die, Let it be fighting for the truth. Dr. Matthews observed the interaction between the two with a mixture of admiration and sadness. He saw in them the children he never had, united by a courage he himself had not demonstrated when he was younger. "You won't face this alone," he said finally. "I'm also guilty in what happened to your families. If it's time to settle accounts, it's time for me to do my part." "Samuel, you've suffered enough," said Richard. "I killed 3 innocent people based on a misguided vengeance. No suffering is enough for that." Samuel approached the table where the documents were. "But perhaps I can turn my guilt into something useful." "How?" "I'll look for Edward's partners. As a doctor, I have access to certain powerful families in the region. I can find out who's still alive, who still has an interest in keeping these secrets buried." Samuel looked directly at Emily. "And I'll do this as your father, not biological, but chosen. A father who will finally protect his daughter as he should have done 24 years ago." The emotion that overtook Emily was overwhelming. For the first time in her life, she felt she had a real family. Not just Richard, her blood brother, but Samuel, who had chosen to be her father when the truth could have freed him from any responsibility, and Mrs. Henderson, who had always been more than a housekeeper. She had been the guardian of her secrets and her safety. "Then it's decided," said Dr. Sanders, storing the documents in a security folder. "We'll proceed with caution, but we will proceed. I'll take the evidence to Washington, D.C. tomorrow morning. You stay together and don't leave the property until I give you news." That night after the lawyer left, the 4 gathered in the library around the lit fireplace. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a simple dinner, and for the first time since she arrived at the mansion, Emily felt truly at home. "You know what's strange?" she said, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "Throughout my life I dreamed of having a family. I imagined what it would be like to have parents, siblings, people who cared about me. I never imagined I would find all this in the place where my mother was murdered." "Your mother brought you back home," said Mrs. Henderson softly. "Not physically, but in all the other ways that matter." Richard took Emily's hand, not with the desire he felt before, but with the deep affection that only siblings can share. "She brought us to each other too. If it weren't for Claire, I would still be just a rich and empty man, haunted by guilt I didn't understand. And I would still be a man consumed by vengeance, killing innocents in the name of a love that was never reciprocated," added Samuel. Outside, the wind from the hills began to blow harder, making the old windows of the mansion tremble. But inside the library, for the first time in decades, there was peace, a fragile peace, threatened by unknown dangers but real. "Whatever happens tomorrow," said Emily, "I want you to know that this was the best night of my life." It was a brave statement, considering that death threats loomed over them. But it was also true. For the first time, Emily Morgan knew exactly who she was, where she came from and where she was going. And she wasn't going alone. Dawn brought with it a dense fog that enveloped the mansion like a protective mantle, but Emily woke up with the unsettling feeling that they were being watched. There was something different in the silence that hung over the property, a silence charged with expectation, as if the hills themselves were holding their breath. Richard was already awake when she went down to the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of cold coffee in his hands and staring fixedly out the window that faced the access road to the property. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, serving herself coffee from the thermos that Mrs. Henderson always left prepared. "I had the impression I heard cars on the road during the night, several cars, but none came up here." He turned to face her, and Emily saw genuine concern in his grey eyes. "I'm starting to think we underestimated the reach of my father's connections. You think they already know we found the evidence? In small towns like this, news travels fast. Dr. Sanders' visit didn't go unnoticed, and if there really are powerful people interested in keeping the secrets buried..." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Matthews, who appeared at the back door with a somber expression that confirmed both their worst fears. His clothes were wrinkled, as if he had spent the entire night awake, and there was a tension in his posture that spoke of disturbing discoveries. "We need to talk," he said, looking around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "I got information about Edward's partners, but the news isn't good." The 3 headed to the library, where Mrs. Henderson was already waiting for them with a tray of bread and fresh coffee. The housekeeper had developed a sixth sense for crisis situations over decades of serving the Blackwood family. "I spent the whole night making discreet calls, talking to people I've known over the years," began Samuel, sitting heavily in an armchair. Edward didn't just have local partners. There was a network that extended to Portland, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. politicians, businessmen, even some judges. "Are they still alive?" asked Richard. "Most of them, yes, and some are in even more powerful positions than they were at the time." Samuel took a piece of paper from his pocket, a list of names he had noted during his nocturnal investigations. Senator August Morris, who today chairs the Justice Commission of the Senate. Businessman Henry Walker, owner of one of the country's largest construction companies. Judge Philip Morrison, of the Supreme Court of Washington State. Emily felt a chill in her stomach. "Do they know we're investigating?" "Worse than that. I discovered that Dr. Sanders never reached Washington, D.C. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard was the first to find his voice. "What do you mean?" "I called his office early this morning. The secretary said he didn't show up yesterday, and his car was found abandoned on a secondary road on the way to the Capitol. No sign of him or the documents." Emily rose abruptly, adrenaline rushing through her veins. "They got him. The documents disappeared." "Not all of them," said a familiar voice from the entrance of the library. Everyone turned to see Dr. Sanders standing at the door, visibly shaken but alive. His clothes were dirty. There was a cut on his forehead, and his hands trembled slightly, but he was firmly holding a leather folder against his chest. "Marcus!" Richard stood up. "We thought you—" "It almost happened," said the lawyer, entering and collapsing into a chair. "I was intercepted by 3 men about 30 miles from here. Professionals, well-dressed, well-armed. They wanted the documents." "How did you escape?" asked Samuel. "Because I made copies before I left. I left the originals at home in a safe and only took a selection of the most important ones." Sanders opened the folder and showed about 20 carefully organized documents. "When they realized they weren't all the originals, they gave me an ultimatum: convince you to give up or face the consequences." "What consequences?" Emily's question came out as a whisper. "They know everything about you, Richard. Your routine, your habits, your psychological vulnerabilities. About you, Emily, where you lived before, your friends from the orphanage, even about Mrs. Henderson." Sanders looked at the doctor. "And about you, Dr. Matthews. They know about the patients you couldn't save over the years, about the medical errors you covered up out of compassion for the families." "That's blackmail," said Richard. "It's war," corrected Sanders, "and they have many more resources than we do." It was then that Mrs. Henderson, who had remained silent, organizing the coffee table, spoke with a calmness that surprised everyone. Not necessarily. Everyone turned to her, and Emily had the impression that the housekeeper had transformed again before her eyes. She was no longer the discreet and efficient woman they knew, but someone with an authority and intelligence that had remained hidden for decades. "Mrs. Henderson?" said Richard, confused. "There are things about me you don't know," she said, sitting at the table with royal dignity. "Before coming to work for your family, Richard, I was an investigative journalist. I worked for the Washington Post in the 1980s, investigating corruption in the military government. The revelation fell like a bomb in the silence of the library." "Why did you never say anything?" asked Emily. "Because I needed to disappear. In 1988, I was investigating a money laundering scheme that involved military officials and businessmen. I discovered connections that would lead straight to the heart of power. But before I could publish, my source was assassinated, and I began to receive death threats." Mrs. Henderson sighed deeply. "I faked my own death, created a new identity, and ended up here where I thought I would be safe." "And your family? Your friends?" "I sacrificed everything for the truth, and for the right to stay alive." She looked directly at Emily. "When your mother came to me, desperate, I saw in Claire the same courage that had led me to investigative journalism. That's why I helped her, and that's why I kept her secrets all these years." Richard was dumbfounded. "You mean that all this time?" "All this time I was documenting everything. Every suspicious conversation I overheard, every strange visitor who came to the house, every movement of your father's business that seemed irregular to me. Mrs. Henderson stood up and walked to a specific bookshelf in the library. She pressed. A hidden mechanism, and an entire section of the bookshelf opened, revealing an immense personal archive. "My God," murmured Dr. Sanders, approaching the methodically organized folders. "There are decades of material here, including detailed records of all of Edward's partners, their properties, their financial schemes, their political connections." Mrs. Henderson smiled for the first time since she began her revelation. "And, most importantly, evidence that they continued the crimes even after Edward's death." Emily felt as if she were living in a dream. The woman she had known as a discreet housekeeper was in fact an experienced investigator who had spent decades collecting evidence that could destroy an entire criminal network. "Why didn't you use this information before?" asked Samuel. "Because I didn't have the original documents that Claire hid. Without them, my evidence was circumstantial. But now..." She gestured to the metal box that was still on the table, containing the evidence left by Claire. "Now we have everything we need to destroy not just Edward Blackwood's memory, but the entire criminal network he helped build." Dr. Sanders quickly examined some of Mrs. Henderson's folders, and his expression changed from surprise to euphoria. "This is more explosive than anything I've ever seen. With this material, we can prosecute at least 30 influential people." "And do they know about this?" asked Richard. "They suspect," replied Mrs. Henderson. "That's why they increased the 2EC pressure now. They know time is running out." It was then that they heard the sound everyone feared, cars coming up the mansion's road. Several cars with powerful engines and tires screeching on the asphalt, wet from the previous night's rain. "They're here," said Emily, her voice calm despite the fear she felt. Richard walked to the window and looked outside. 4 black cars, at least 12 men. He turned to the others, and there was a fierce determination in his eyes. "Well, it seems the time has come to find out if we're brave enough to face the consequences of seeking the truth." The sound of cars stopping in front of the mansion echoed like a harbinger of storm. Through the library window, Richard could see men in dark suits getting out of the vehicles with coordinated and professional movements. They weren't simple thugs. They were experienced operators, the kind of people who discreetly solve problems. Very powerful people. "How many exits does this house have?" asked Dr. Sanders, trying to keep his voice calm while quickly organizing the most important documents. "Several," replied Mrs. Henderson, taking command of the situation with a naturalness that revealed her experience in dangerous situations. "But they've certainly posted men at all of them. They didn't come here to give us a chance to escape." Emily felt her heart beating strongly, but a strange calm had taken hold of her. It was as if her entire life had prepared her for this moment. Years of loneliness in the orphanage, of silently observing, of preparing to fight when necessary. "What exactly do they want?" she asked. "To silence us definitively," said Richard, moving away from the window, "or to make us an offer we can't refuse." The doorbell rang, a civilized sound that absurdly contrasted with the deadly tension that hung in the air. Then a polite but firm voice echoed from outside. "Mr. Blackwood, we would like to talk. We have a proposal that will certainly be in everyone's interest." Mrs. Henderson gestured for them to remain silent and walked to a specific wall in the library. She pressed a hidden mechanism, and a section of the wall slid, revealing an old intercom system that allowed them to hear conversations throughout the house. "Your father installed this to spy on the staff and visitors," she whispered to Richard. "But today it will serve our purposes." The voice outside continued. "We know you're in there and we know exactly what you found. We didn't come here to harm anyone. We came to do business." Dr. Matthews approached the window carefully, observing the disposition of the men. 12 people, well-armed, strategically positioned. Whoever the mastermind is, they're not playing. "Around Richard Blackwood." The voice became louder, more impatient. "My name is Victor Kozlov. I represent a consortium of businessmen who had dealings with your father. We can resolve this in a civilized manner, or we can resolve it in other ways. The choice is yours." Victor Kozlov, Emily recognized the name from the documents they had found, one of Edward Blackwood's main partners, a specialist in solving problems for the American elite. If he himself had come there, it was because they considered the situation extremely dangerous. Richard took a deep breath and headed to the main door. "I'm going to talk to them," he said. "No," Emily held him by the arm. "It's too risky. They won't shoot me at the door of my house, not with so many potential witnesses in the region. But I need to know exactly what they want." Richard looked into her eyes with a fraternal tenderness that reassured her. "Trust me." When Richard opened the main door, he found Viktor Kozlov standing on the porch, a man in his 60s, perfectly combed white hair, impeccable Italian suit, and blue eyes cold as ice. Next to him, two younger men maintained a relaxed but alert posture. "Mr. Blackwood," said Kozlov with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for answering. May I come in? We have much to discuss." "I prefer we talk right here," replied Richard, keeping the door just slightly ajar. "As you wish." Kozlov gestured for his men to step back a few paces, a theatrical gesture of goodwill. "I came here to make you a generous offer. We know you found some old documents related to your father's business, documents that, out of context, might appear compromising. Compromising is an interesting euphemism for murder evidence." Kozlov laughed, a dry sound without humor. "Your father was an aggressive businessman in a different era. He made choices that today would be questionable, but at the time were necessary for the development of the region. These documents, if misinterpreted, could unjustly tarnish the reputation of many respectable people who simply tried to build a better America. And what is your proposal?" $50 million, said Kozlov without blinking, "deposited in an offshore account of your choice. In exchange, you hand over all the documents, sign confidentiality agreements, and everyone goes on with their lives in peace." It was an astronomical amount, enough to ensure that Richard and Emily would never have to worry about money again. But Richard didn't hesitate for even a second. No. Kozlov's expression didn't change, but something cold passed through his eyes. "That's a shame. I was hoping you'd be more rational than your father." "My father was a murderer. If that's rationality, I prefer to be crazy. Your father understood how the world really works, understood that some truths are too expensive to be told." Kozlov took a step forward, and Richard noticed that the other men had moved to more advantageous positions. "Natimadi, let me reformulate my offer. 100 million, that's my final offer. And if I refuse again?" "Then we'll talk to Miss Morgan. I imagine she's more flexible when she fully understands what's at stake." It was the threat Richard had been waiting for. Without warning, he retreated into the house and slammed the door hard, quickly locking the 3 security locks that Edward had installed years ago. "Did you understand the proposal?" he asked, upon returning to the library, where the others had followed the entire conversation through the intercom system. 100 million is a lot of money, said Dr. Sanders, but his voice made it clear he wasn't considering accepting. "They have that money because they stole much more than that over the years," replied Emily. "How many families were destroyed so they could make this offer?" Outside, Kozlov's voice sounded again, but now without the previous courtesy. "Mr. Blackwood, you're making a very serious mistake. We have detailed information about all of you. About the patients Dr. Matthews lost through negligence. About the small thefts Miss Morgan committed when she was a teenager at the orphanage. About the, let's say, intimate habits of Mrs. Henderson when she was a journalist." Mrs. Henderson tensed, but didn't show surprise. "They did their homework," she murmured. "We also know," continued Kozlov, "about the true cause of Robert Blackwood's death. We know that Richard has been covering up his brother's suicide for 15 years. We know about the therapy sessions he had in private psychiatric clinics. With each revelation, the men outside demonstrated the reach of their influence and resources. They had investigated every aspect of the four's lives, looking for weak points they could exploit. But you know what they don't know?" said Emily suddenly, a brilliant idea taking shape in her mind. "What?" asked Richard. "They think we came here to blackmail or make deals. Emily smiled, and there was something fierce in that smile. They don't know we've already sent copies of everything to 3 different newspapers, to the Federal Prosecutor's Office and to the FBI. But we haven't, began Samuel. Not yet, interrupted Mrs. Henderson, immediately understanding Emily's plan. But we have the means to do it, now. The ex-journalist went to an old computer hidden in her secret archive. I have contacts in newsrooms all over the country, people who trust me and who would publish this information even without prior verification, just based on my word. How much time do you need? Asked Richard. 10 minutes to scan the main documents and send them to 5 different media outlets simultaneously. Outside, Kozlov had lost his patience. You have 2 minutes to open this door and start being reasonable. After that, my men will enter anyway, and the conversation will become much more uncomfortable. Do it, said Emily, looking at each of the others. If we're going to die today, let it be knowing that the truth about my mother won't die with us. Mrs. Henderson turned on the computer and began working frenetically, scanning documents while Richard and Samuel barricaded the main door with heavy furniture. Dr. Sanders organized the most important papers in an order that facilitated scanning. 7 minutes, announced Mrs. Henderson, her fingers flying over the keyboard. From outside, they heard the unmistakable sound of men positioning themselves to force entry. 5 minutes, said Mrs. Henderson. The sound of glass breaking came from the ground floor windows. They were entering from all sides. 3 minutes, murmured Mrs. Henderson, sweat running down her forehead. Heavy footsteps echoed through the main hall, voices coordinating the siege of the library. 1 minute. The library door shook with the first impact. In seconds it would be broken down. Done! Shouted Mrs. Henderson, pressing the enter key. Sent to the New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, and Associated Press. In 15 minutes, half the country will know the truth about Edward Blackwood and his partners. The library door shattered. When the library, Dr. shattered, Emily expected armed men to invade the environment. Instead, only Victor Kozlov entered alone, with empty hands and a defeated expression she never imagined seeing on that cold face. "Congratulations," he said, his voice sounding tired. "You won." Richard positioned himself in front of the others, still tense for a fight that apparently wouldn't come. "What happened to your men?" "They're withdrawing," replied Kozlov, walking to an armchair and sitting down without being invited. 3 minutes after you sent the documents, my phone began to ring. First it was Senator Morris, then Judge Morrison, then half a dozen panicked businessmen. He laughed bitterly. "You know how I discovered you had succeeded? Because my own clients began to offer me as a scapegoat." Mrs. Henderson, who was still at the computer monitoring the online repercussions, looked up. "The newspapers have already begun to publish the first articles. In 2 hours, this will be on the main television news in the country. And in 6 hours, half of these powerful people you represent will be denying any connection with you," added Dr. Sanders, understanding the situation. Kozlov nodded sadly. "Exactly. When you work for people who built empires on lies, the first thing they learn is how to get rid of those who know too much." He looked directly at Emily. "Your mother would be proud of you. You knew her. I knew her. It was hard not to notice Claire Morgan. Intelligent, brave, observant. Edward told me she was becoming a problem, but I advised caution, said that killing a pregnant maid would bring more problems than solutions." Kozlov sighed deeply. He didn't. "Listen to me and look what happened." "Why are you telling us this?" asked Richard, suspicious. "Because in a few hours I'll be dead or in prison, and because after 40 years facilitating crimes for cowardly rich men, I discovered I still have something resembling a conscience." Kozlov stood up and walked to the window, observing his own men moving away from the property. "You know what my first job for your father was? Bribing a judge so he would acquit a businessman who had killed 3 workers in a badly done construction. I was 25 and needed money. I thought it would be just once." "But it wasn't," said Emily. "It's never just once. Each crime leads To another crime, each lie requires 10 new lies to sustain itself. In 40 years, I helped cover up murders, thefts, rapes, disappearances. He turned to face them again. How many people like your mother died because I was too efficient at my job? Dr. Matthews, who had remained silent observing Kozlov's confession, finally spoke. If you really want to do something to compensate, help us identify all the victims. Give names, dates, locations. Allow the families to finally know the truth. I've already prepared everything, said Kozlov, taking a pen drive from his jacket pocket. 40 years of digitized files. Names, dates, methods, instigators. Everything I managed to save over the years. He extended the device to Emily. It's yours. Make good use of it. Emily took the pen drive with trembling hands. It was a small object, insignificant in appearance, but containing decades of crimes that could finally be clarified. Why to me? Because you're the only one here who has nothing to gain besides justice. Richard still carries the weight of the family name. Dr. Matthews still feels guilty for his own crimes. Mrs. Henderson still has accounts to settle with the past. Kozlov smiled for the first time since entering the library. But you just want your mother to finally rest. In peace. The sound of sirens in the distance interrupted the moment. Police sirens rapidly approaching along the hill road. I called them, said Mrs. Henderson simply. While you were talking, I thought it was time for Viktor Kozlov to officially answer. For his crimes. Kozlov nodded without surprise. Thank you. I prefer to be arrested than executed by my own clients. He headed to the door but stopped at the threshold. There's one thing you need to know about the future. What? Asked Richard. These people you're exposing? They won't disappear overnight. They'll fight. They'll try to defend themselves. They'll hire the best lawyers money can buy. The process will be long, painful, and you'll be at the center of everything. We're prepared, said Emily. I hope so. Because you just declared war against some of the most powerful people in America. The sirens were very close now. Kozlov walked calmly toward the main door, where he would surrender to the police without resistance. Victor, called Emily. He turned. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he replied. Thank me when the last of these criminals is behind bars. After Kozlov's arrest and the initial statements to the FBI, the four gathered again in the library, now with the doors open and the broken windows letting in the fresh breeze from the hills. The contrast with the tension of the previous hours was surreal. And now? Asked Dr. Sanders, who had returned with a team of lawyers specializing in human rights. Now we begin the real work, replied Emily, looking at Kozlov's pen drive. We're going to identify each victim, contact each family, ensure that each crime is properly investigated. It will take years, warned Richard. I have time. Dr. Matthews approached her, and for the first time since they met, she saw peace in his eyes. Can I continue being your father? Not biological, but chosen? Emily hugged him, finally feeling that she had a real family. You always were. Richard observed the scene with a smile she hadn't seen on his face since she met him. You know what's funny? He said. For years I thought this house was cursed, that it carried the ghosts of my family's crimes, but now I realize they weren't ghosts. They were secrets waiting to be revealed. And now that they've been revealed, asked Mrs. Henderson, now we can finally live. 6 months later, the Blackwood mansion had completely transformed. Where silence and melancholy once reigned, now there was life, movement, purpose. Emily had converted part of the property into a support center for families of violence victims, offering free legal assistance and psychological support. Richard had discovered a vocation he never knew he possessed, teaching. He had become a volunteer teacher at a technical school in the region, teaching underprivileged young people about administration and ethical entrepreneurship. Dr. Matthews divided his time between the medical center he had set up on the property, offering free care to the local community, and the therapy sessions he had with Emily, finally building the father-daughter relationship they both had always wanted. Mrs. Henderson had returned to journalism, this time as an editor of an online magazine specializing in investigative journalism. coordinating a network of reporters dedicated to exposing crimes against human rights. On the afternoon of a sunny Thursday, Emily was in the garden of the mansion planting red roses in a flower bed she had created in honor of her mother. Richard approached carrying an official envelope. "It arrived," he said, extending the paper. It was Claire Morgan's rectified death certificate. After 6 months of legal battle, she had finally managed to have her mother's death officially recognized as murder, not as an accident. "Now she can rest in peace," murmured Emily, wiping away a tear that insisted on falling. "We all can," said Richard, kneeling beside her to help plant the roses. From the top of the hill, the Blackwood mansion overlooked the hills with open windows and abundant light entering all rooms. The third floor, previously forbidden, had become an art studio where Emily painted pictures that told stories of overcoming and hope. The old mirror in the main hall was still there, but it no longer haunted anyone. It reflected only reality, a chosen family, built on truth and love, living in a house that had finally learned to be a home. In the kitchen, Mrs. Henderson prepared dinner, humming a song she hadn't heard in decades. In the library, Dr. Matthews read to a group of children from the community who came every Thursday to hear stories. And in the garden, Emily and Richard planted flowers under the afternoon sun, building beauty on the land that had previously known only pain. The story of the Blackwoods hadn't ended with crimes and tragedies. It had restarted with truth, justice, and the discovery that some families aren't born ready. They are built day after day, choice after choice, act of love after act of love. When the last roses were planted and watered, Emily stood up and looked one last time at the window of the third floor where her mother had died. But she didn't see death there. She saw new life, infinite possibilities, and the certainty that Claire Morgan had finally achieved what she most desired, that her daughter would grow up surrounded by love, truth, and the courage to always do what is right, no matter the cost. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered to the wind from